Hello, it's Mike Pangia, and today we're going to make sourdough bread. I should say we're going to make sourdough bread again. I've done this before with you, and I have a lot of updates and changes and improvements that I want to put into it, so we're going to start again. Now, let me give you a little bit of history. I've been making sourdough bread for about 3 years, and I remind myself a bit of a mad scientist. Each time I made it, I took notes, what I did, I recorded everything, and then I critiqued the bread, whether it took too long to rise, or the dough was too sticky to work, or the crumb, which is basically the density, the way the bubbles form inside the bread, was too heavy or too light, or the oven spring was too little or non-existent. That's the amount the bread rises once you start baking it. The rise time to get the loaf to full size, how much rise time it took, whether it took too much and I had to improve it, whether it filled the loaf pan or overfilled the loaf pan. These are all things I had to take note of. And each time I took a note of something that was, if not a flaw, a little bit of an issue with me, something that I felt could have been done better. Each time I had something like that that I noted in my log, I'd suggest to myself an improvement for what I could try next time to see if I can improve it. And I've been doing that for 3 years. I've made a lot of bread, and I've made a lot of changes to how I do it. So what I'm going to show you today is the result of all of that experimenting, all of that note-taking, all of that chemical work that I did, the lab reports that I did, all of that. And hopefully we're going to come out with a terrific bread. Here are the ingredients I use to make sourdough bread. And here is the step-by-step procedure I'll be going through in this video. Before you make your bread, it's important to focus on your starter. Now, you have an existing alive starter, active starter, I'm assuming. What you do before each feeding, you dump out what you have and leave 1 inch to 1.5 inches of starter in your starter jar, okay? I have a mason jar, I have a 1 quart mason jar that I use. So dump it all out till you have about 1.5 inches of your old starter left. Then feed it. When you're done feeding it, mark the level with a rubber band. That's the easiest thing to do. Then you let it sit 6-7 hours till you see. At the point where it has doubled, at least doubled, you're ready to use it. And here's what that looks like. I have my own starter here. Here's the level I started with, and here's where it's gone to. So this is ready to go. I'm going to show you a picture also of the bubbles on top. Very active bubbles. So we are really ready to proceed. For my sourdough starter, I use 85% bread flour and 15% whole wheat flour, and an equal amount of warm distilled water. Now, the bread I'm going to make, I make in a loaf pan. It's a 5x9, pretty standard loaf pan, and I hope I'm not going to bore you all and lose you all with the math I'm about to go over with you. But the way you can proportion the ingredients in this recipe by knowing the displacement or the volume of your loaf pan compared to this one. All right, stay with me just a minute. If you have this kind of loaf pan, skip this part. But if you have a smaller one or a larger one, here's what we have to know. You have to fill it right to the top with water while it's on your zeroed kitchen scale. You fill it right to the top with water, level with the top, and you measure how many grams that is, okay? Take that number and make a fraction. Put that number over 1,854. Now, I don't want you to get upset if you're one of those kids in school who said you're never going to use any of this. It's not true, because in bread making and a lot of other baking, you are going to use a lot of it. So take your displacement. You just figured out how many grams of water your loaf pan held. Make a fraction. Put the numerator, that number that you just figured out, over 1854. Use your calculator and that fraction times each ingredient that I've listed, and that'll give you the right amount of flour and starter, etc., etc., for your particular loaf pan. Okay, everybody back with me. Let's get back to normal. One thing I experimented with over the course of all this bread making and note taking that I did is the concept of autolyse. Autolyse is where you take a good portion of the water that you're going to use to make your dough in with the flour. You stir it up, you mix it, and you let it sit for a half an hour or an hour or so. And that process is called autolyse. It's supposed to get the the gluten in the flour ready to bake and improve it. Here's what I did. I tried it many times with and without autolyse, and I could not find any difference. So I'm leaving it out. The other thing is you'll find a sequence where they take the yeast, the natural yeast, the starter, and they'll put it aside and they'll pinch it in later, and they'll hold the ingredients, do them a little bit at a time. Here's what I found. You can put them all together in your mix at the start. It's much easier. You go down your list of ingredients, you put them all in a bowl, you mix them up. It works fine. I've tried it all different ways. It doesn't make any difference. Okay? So in the interest of simplicity, that's what I'm going to do. We'll start with 397 grams of bread flour. I'll give you the cups and teaspoons later in the video. Next is 70 grams of whole wheat flour. You should mix up the dry ingredients before you add the water. Now 318 grams of warm water. Before adding the starter, I mix that to make it a uniform shaggy dough. Now for the star of the show and the key to our success, I'm going to add 80 grams of sourdough starter. Now I'm going to seal up the starter and put it in the refrigerator so it can fight for us another day. I'm going to stir the starter in. Once it's pretty well mixed, I think it's a good practice to use your hand and do what's called pinching it in with regard to the starter. I think it gives a better mix and better results. The last thing I'm going to add in is 9 grams of salt. Now I am putting this at the end because a lot of baking articles that I've seen claim that the salt could counter the effect of the yeast rising. So I hold it off till the end. Now the last bit of hand mixing to get the salt mixed in well. I have wet my hand before doing this, and that helps limit the dough sticking to me. Now I'm going to prepare what's known as a proofing box. It's a food storage container with a lid. If you don't have one or you can't get one, you can use a large bowl with a cover or stretch some saran wrap over it to make a cover. Okay, what we're going to do with our proofing box is put a little bit of oil in it and spread it around to coat all of the inside surfaces. Once that's done, we can transfer our ball of dough to the proofing box. Roll it around a bit so it gets coated with the oil. Put the cover on and put it in a warm place. Set your timer for 3.5 hours. That's going to be the end of this process. I set another timer for 30 minutes, which is when we're going to handle this dough. We're going to do a stretch and fold after 30 minutes. Meanwhile, I put it in a warm place. I use my cool oven with just the oven light on, and that's where I proof my bread dough. We've done our first 30 minutes, and I have a bowl of water here to keep my hand wet, and that keeps the dough from sticking to my hand. Reach underneath and stretch it up, fold it back. Reach underneath, stretch it up, and fold it back. Turn your box 90 degrees each time, so you stretch it in each of the directions. I'm going to cover it back up and put it back into the cool oven with the light on. This is my fourth and final stretch and fold, and I want to show you something I do a little differently from what you may have seen in other videos and other instruction. What I do differently is basically a two-handed stretch and fold. I think it's more efficient. I get more of a stretch and a better fold. You might be able to see that this dough has firmed up quite a bit. It's really looking good. Oh, Pee-wee, come on, we're getting to the end. Please quiet down. That's my duck squeaking his play toy. Please, please, Pee-wee, come on, we're trying to help these people make some sourdough bread. Quiet down. Okay, so the last stretch and fold. Now I'm going to put it back in my proofing box and put it back in the cool oven with just the oven light on. It's been 3.5 hours and we're ready to proceed. I want to flour my work surface lightly so that we can form the dough roughly into a loaf shape. The dough feels really great, very pliable, soft. Now the reason I don't want to overwork it at this point is because the crumb inside, the bubbles inside the dough are there, and if we push it around too much, they'll collapse. Now I've prepared the loaf pan by spraying it with cooking spray, and I'm now going to put our loaf into it. Bloop, there we go. Now a little water spray over the top of it, and we'll come back and take another look at it in 15 or 20 minutes. When the dough rises above the top of the loaf pan, it's ready to bake. Now it's ready to go into the oven. 22 minutes at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 505 Kelvin. Okay, we've baked this thing at 450 degrees for 22 minutes, and it looks pretty good. It's still a little warm, but I think it's cool enough to cut. So let's give it a cut and see what we've made. Wow, it really looks good. It really looks good. Well, that's it. After all the tweaking and baking and adjustments I've made, I really feel that this is my best sourdough bread loaf ever. And I hope you'll make it and you'll think the same thing when you make it. Meanwhile, if you haven't yet subscribed, I'm asking you, please subscribe. More importantly, if you know someone else that might be interested in sourdough bread and improving their technique or starting a technique if they have never done it before, please share this video. Mark the share button on this display and share it with them. I really appreciate that. I think it's important that I spend a little more time with you on starter. I'm going to start with the group of you that already has a living active starter. So what you do is you dump out almost all of it. I don't care if you make sourdough pancakes or what you do with it, or if you put it in the trash. But I need you to reduce the amount in your container to only about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of your existing active starter. Then you're going to feed it. What are you going to feed it with? I want you to feed it with a 15% mix of whole wheat flour against bread flour. Can you do the math? Can you figure it out? That means if you're going to use 100 grams total, make it 85 grams of bread flour and 15 grams of whole wheat flour. That's not too hard. Okay, now you use that flour mix with an equal weight of water. Now your water has to be either distilled water with no chlorine or fluorine in it. If you can't get that, and I don't want you to go out in a pandemic to buy it and take the risk, here's what you do. Use tap water. Set it on your counter in a large container and let it sit overnight. By doing that overnight, the fluorine or chlorine in that water will evaporate and you'll be left with water that's good to make bread, okay? So now, you've dumped out your starter and you're gonna feed it with the method I just described. Feed it morning and night. And again, morning and night. The next morning you'll be ready to make your bread. Meanwhile, you should never let it get above 2 inches total. Once it's above 2 inches, dump it out again, get down to 1 inch or 1.5 inches again to feed it. Now you're gonna see that after you feed it, it's gonna double or even triple in size. That's good, that's healthy, that's what you want. Okay, that's for you guys that already have active starter. If you have no active starter and you're starting from scratch, you're basically gonna do the same thing I just described. You're gonna start with an equal amount of water and flour by weight. But that flour, make 15% of it whole wheat flour. Mix it up real well in your container and let it sit in a protected spot. You can cover it with a piece of gauze or paper towel held on with a rubber band, or a piece of plastic wrap loosely laid on top, and use the cap of the mason jar lightly just to hold it in place. You can use any of those things for a cover. I recommend you do cover it though, because insects would like it. They'd like to get in there. So I'd rather you don't have that problem. Okay, you're making new starter, right? So you do this procedure morning and night, morning and night. You do it for probably 4 or 5 days. Meanwhile, the thing is building up. Once it gets to be about 3 inches, dump it out, get it back down to 1.5 inches in your container, okay? Then follow the rest of the directions and you're gonna be good. I hope this doesn't sound too complicated. If there are any questions on any of it, please write me in the comments. I'll answer you back. That's a good way to do it because everybody can see the answer. Or you're welcome to email me at mike@mikepanja.com. Either way. Thanks again for watching this lengthy discourse. Good luck with your bread. If you make a nice loaf of bread, send me a picture. Send it through email and I'll feature it on a future video. Meanwhile, let me point out that by making bread in the loaf pan, we avoid a couple of problems. Number one, the slices are uniform size from one end to the other. That's a nice feature. Instead of having great big slices in the middle of the loaf and little bitty slices near the end of the loaf. So that's an advantage of using a loaf pan. The other thing is look at the size of the bubbles in my bread. They're prominent, but they're small. Typical breads that you'll see online will have these huge holes where all the filling falls through them. I don't think that makes any sense. So I prefer the loaf pan method. Anyway, thanks again for watching and putting up with all of this. I look forward to seeing you again next time.